It was just another ordinary day on the main street of the city. Cars moved in a steady flow, honking their horns, and people rushed in different directions. But amidst the busy crowd, John, a middle-aged man, felt his mind empty and weary. Working at a large financial firm, he had achieved success, but that success didn't bring him the satisfaction he had hoped for. What John sought was not wealth, but a sense of self-affirmation in a world he felt was losing its order. John often found himself thinking about the changes in society, about the growing presence of outsiders in his neighborhood. He was not someone who easily embraced change. These thoughts were not new, but had been ingrained in his mind over many years, nurtured by conversations with friends and colleagues who shared similar views. In his heart, the increasing presence of people of color, especially in the expensive neighborhoods where he lived, was something he found unsettling. Then, as he was walking down the street, he saw a black man, David, passing by. David had a remarkable presence. He was unlike anyone John had encountered before. With a sleek black suit and a calm demeanor, David exuded confidence and power. But in John's eyes, he was just another stranger, and the difference in skin color quickly stirred negative emotions within him. David, unaware of John's attention, continued walking, but something in John's gaze made him unable to look away. He felt an intrusion into his personal space. And in that moment, anger began to rise within him. What does this guy think he is, walking past me like that? John wondered to himself, with anger and prejudice quickly taking over his mind. John could not bear the feeling that David evoked. He continued walking, but in John's mind, the black man had become a symbol of everything he could not accept in society. Negative thoughts continued to form in his head. If this keeps up, we'll never be able to live in peace, he muttered. They come and take over the places we've built. John's life had always been tied to these views. He grew up in a conservative family where differences in race and culture were always seen as a threat. Even though he worked at a large company and interacted with people from various cultures, the prejudices within him remained unchanged. While John was still lost in his thoughts, David had walked further away, unaware that he had become the target of John's negative emotions. However, the tension inside John did not subside. He began to follow David, keeping his distance, his eyes fixed on every step the black man took. The strange feelings inside him grew stronger, and it seemed like he could not control his anger. As David passed a busy intersection, a sudden decision came to John's mind. He walked quickly towards David, his thoughts in turmoil. Part of him knew he was doing something wrong, but his anger was uncontrollable. "Hey, who are you to walk through here like it's your house?" John shouted. His words were sharp and full of contempt. David stopped, but instead of reacting with anger, he just turned to look at John calmly. "I'm just walking through," David replied, his voice devoid of any tension or worry. This only made John angrier. "Walking through? Who do you think you are?" John stepped closer, his eyes cold. He couldn't hold back any longer. In a moment of loss of control, he pushed David hard. David didn't expect to encounter such a person. He just wanted to keep walking, but he couldn't have imagined that John's actions were a provocation. He didn't react, just stood there, letting John's anger pour out on him. And then, a slap from John suddenly made David fall backwards. Passers-by started to turn their heads to look, but no one dared to intervene. John didn't know what he was doing. Anger had taken over his mind. He no longer realized that he was beating a man who would later affect his entire life. His rage kept growing. Each blow was an insult pouring out of his mouth. After a while, John's anger seemed to have subsided. He stood there panting, seeing David still lying on the ground. But there was no reaction. Finally, he turned around and left, leaving David alone. A sense of satisfaction that he had made that man know his place filled him. David was still lying there, showing no signs of pain or anger. He did not rush to stand up immediately. Instead, he sat there for a while, closing his eyes and breathing deeply. Everyone around him continued with their lives. But no one dared to come near to help David. When he felt calm enough, David stood up and dusted off his clothes. There was not a trace of tension on his face. He looked at John, who had left, and just sighed. An indescribable feeling rushed over David. He knew that this incident was not simply a random encounter. This was a sign, a message that he had to face. David continued walking, but this time, his mind was no longer filled with simple thoughts of an ordinary life. He felt like he had just stepped into a greater challenge, one that he had never anticipated. After the incident on the street, David refused to let himself forget what had happened. He wasn't the kind of person who could easily set aside significant events without reflecting on them. He was a judge, not only because he possessed the capability and talent, but because he understood the value of justice, equality, and respect for all people. He often faced difficult situations in his work, but he had never before endured such an insult. When he arrived home, David went straight to his study. He sat at his desk, piled high with legal documents, but at that moment, his mind was fixated on a single thought. Why? How could someone behave like that in today's society? David pondered his next steps. He didn't want to act rashly. He wanted to understand the reasons behind John's actions. While such an insult could provoke anyone into an outburst of anger, David didn't want to take that route. He was a judge, and in his profession, he had learned that no problem could be solved through anger and impulsive decisions. David began gathering information about John. He tapped into his professional network, reaching out to friends who might be able to help. It wasn't long before he discovered that John was a senior executive at a large financial firm, a man who appeared successful and powerful in society. But deep down, John harbored conservative and racist views. The ideology John adhered to wasn't new to society, but it persisted, quietly and insidiously, eroding the respect and tolerance people should have for one another. One morning, David stood by the window in his study, looking out. A light rain fell outside, but his heart couldn't find peace. He knew he had to confront this matter seriously, not just because of the insult directed at him, but because of what John represented. Such prejudices didn't just harm an individual, they damaged an entire community and the values David had devoted his life to upholding. The next day, John couldn't shake the strange feeling lingering within him after the previous day's incident. Although he had seemed to brush everything off as he walked away from the scene, his mind couldn't escape the image of the black man. David's calm demeanor left him feeling challenged. Why hadn't that man retaliated? John couldn't make sense of it. Instead of reflecting on what he had done, John decided to dismiss the whole incident and focus on work. He walked into the office with his usual confident posture, but the glances his colleagues gave him filled him with unease. No one said anything, but the silence unsettled him. John tried to ignore it, yet deep down, he knew things were no longer the same. John's work began to show signs of trouble. Several key contracts were delayed. Projects he had poured months of effort into started encountering issues. Nothing seemed to run as smoothly as before, and a creeping sense of anxiety followed him at every turn. However, what bothered John the most was a feeling he couldn't deny, the guilt that was slowly taking root in his heart. That day, during an important meeting with clients, John found himself unable to concentrate. Everything around him seemed to blur. His thoughts were adrift, not because of work but because of a man who had crossed his path like a passing breeze. That man was David. David decided he wouldn't let the incident pass without taking action. However, he didn't want to seek revenge in a simplistic way or use his power to hurt John as John had hurt him. David wanted John to understand the consequences of his actions and recognize his own mistakes. David began leveraging his industry connections and carefully crafting a plan. He wanted John to face the repercussions of his mindset, but not in a conventional way. Instead, he aimed to make John experience an unsettling sense of vulnerability he couldn't control. David didn't rush. He began orchestrating subtle scenarios designed to make John feel increasingly uneasy. Everything unfolded gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Information about John's behavior slowly made its way to those around him, creating a growing sense of scrutiny. Colleagues started looking at John with a different kind of gaze, and unexpected encounters began to make him feel trapped in situations from which he couldn't escape. David was not someone who acted impulsively. He understood that time would be his greatest ally in making John confront his wrongdoings. Although David's moves weren't overt, they had begun to ripple through John's life, causing subtle yet undeniable disruptions. David continued investigating John, delving deeper into his personal life. He didn't just want to understand John's professional world. He wanted to uncover the relationships and dynamics in his private life as well. David believed that the best form of retribution wasn't immediate retaliation but making John face the consequences of his actions and recognize the gravity of the racist behavior he had exhibited. One day, David met with an old friend, a seasoned lawyer who had worked alongside him on many major cases. After hearing David recount the incident, the friend advised him not to get too involved. However, David felt that this was no longer just a personal matter. It was part of a larger fight for justice and equality. David decided his response wouldn't merely be about seeking revenge against John. Instead, he resolved to find a way to challenge society's perception of racist behavior. He understood that when someone like John began to feel the real impact of his wrongdoing, he wouldn't be able to remain unchanged. David continued monitoring John's life while carefully crafting a long-term plan. Each step he took was discreet but meticulously calculated. Every detail of his approach was designed to make John confront what he had done, not only for David's sake but for the betterment of the society they shared. John woke up the next morning with an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, as if he hadn't slept properly for an entire week. The anger from the previous day's encounter still gnawed at his mind. He had lashed out at a man driven by unfounded prejudices, and though he tried to deny it, the guilt simmered beneath the surface. Every step he took felt heavy, as though each thought and action was buried under an invisible weight. Work became increasingly difficult. Meetings with partners grew tense. Important contracts he had worked on were suddenly delayed without clear explanation. His colleagues at the company began looking at him differently, their interactions lacking the warmth or enthusiasm they once held. This shift left John feeling confused and more uneasy than ever. Over the following days, strange things began happening. Some partners were no longer willing to work with him, despite previously holding him in high regard. Emails he sent received delayed responses, and even a few crucial calls were postponed without reason. Matters escalated when one of the company's biggest clients decided to take their business elsewhere. John knew this wasn't just a coincidence. One day, while sitting in his office, he received a call from one of his long-term partners. The voice on the other end was distant and cold. "John, we've decided to move forward with another company. Thank you for your cooperation over the years." The words hit John like a punch to the gut. He couldn't fathom what had caused everything to spiral so badly. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like something was amiss. John began questioning whether all of this was a consequence of his actions from the other day. He couldn't be certain, but it was impossible to ignore how quickly and unnaturally these changes had occurred. It felt as if an invisible hand was pushing him into a corner. Inside, his anxiety grew, and the guilt he had been suppressing became harder to bear. During a small meeting with his subordinates, a colleague named Mark, who had been a close friend of John's for years, suddenly brought up something that made John's stomach churn. "John, have you noticed anything strange about your work lately? I've been hearing some rumors about you. Something about an incident on the street, involving a black man." John felt as though he had been struck at his weakest point. He looked at Mark, unsure of how to respond. Mark's words not only left him flustered, but also intensified the already suffocating tension. Then, one evening, while sitting alone in his office, John received an email that was unlike the usual work-related messages. It was an anonymous letter, with no sender's name, but its content stopped him in his tracks. The email contained only one sentence. Perhaps it's time you took a hard look at yourself. Never in his life had John felt such pressure. He couldn't understand why everything was unraveling so quickly. He tried to calm himself, but the fear and guilt surged back, leaving him unable to regain control over his thoughts. The next day, John found himself unable to go about work as usual. He felt shackled by something larger, an overwhelming weight he couldn't shake off. Deciding he needed a break, he left the office and went to a cafe near his company to clear his mind. The peaceful surroundings contrasted sharply with the chaos inside him. Sitting alone, John tried not to think about work or the mounting problems in his life. In moments like this, his mind drifted to his past, how he was raised, the values he was taught as a child. His mother had always told him to live by certain standards, that black people and other minorities could never fully integrate into a predominantly white society like theirs. These thoughts weren't John's own. They were instilled in him by the environment he grew up in. Reflecting on his younger years, John realized just how deeply those flawed perspectives had shaped him. He hadn't even recognized that he was living in a world steeped in racism and injustice. The times he laughed at and mocked black people, joining in because that's what his friends did. Or the evenings spent drinking beer with friends and casually discussing racial differences without a second thought. All of it was built on a foundation of ignorance he hadn't questioned. But now, after his actions toward David, John couldn't escape the truth anymore. He realized that those beliefs weren't just wrong, they were dangerous. He had made a terrible mistake. And now the consequences were beginning to unfold. John stood up from his table and looked out the window, where the rain continued to fall. He wondered if there was still a way to make things right, if he could change himself and atone for the harm he had caused. He thought about David and what he had done to that man. The only question that echoed in his mind was whether he could face his past and find a way to repair the damage he had inflicted. In the days that followed, John decided he wouldn't let things pass without taking action. He knew that regret couldn't simply remain as words or thoughts in his mind. He needed to act, and his actions had to reflect genuine sincerity and a desire to change. John began participating in community activities against racial discrimination. He joined charitable organizations, met people from diverse backgrounds, and listened to perspectives that were foreign to him. He realized that only by confronting society's issues directly could he understand the suffering endured by those who faced discrimination. He attended open dialogues on race, exchanged ideas, and listened to the stories of people he had previously ignored. During one such workshop on tolerance and inclusion, John unexpectedly encountered David again. The first feeling that washed over him wasn't hatred or fear. It was shame and regret. David said nothing, simply looking at him with a perceptive gaze, as though evaluating him. John couldn't find the words to speak. He lowered his head, feeling small and undeserving. But what struck John was that David didn't voice any criticism. Instead, he simply smiled and walked away. That moment made John realize that change doesn't come from condemnation. It must come from within. He needed to prove to the world, and to himself, that he had changed, that he could become a better person. With determination and concrete actions, John began to feel the changes taking root in his life. He resolved not to stop. He would continue striving, not just for himself but for those around him. Most importantly, he wouldn't let his past mistakes define or break him. One day, John found himself standing in David's office. He had arranged the meeting not to apologize or seek forgiveness, but to express his deep gratitude for the transformation David had inspired in him. "David," he began, his voice steady and sincere, "I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I'm changing. I'm not just doing this for myself but for society, for the people who have endured racial discrimination." David looked at him, his deep eyes seeming to pierce through every thought in John's mind. "Change isn't an easy process, John," David replied, his tone calm yet understanding. "But I believe you can do it. What matters most is that you sustain this change, not just for a day, but for a lifetime." Although John had begun taking steps toward change, the guilt still clung to him like a shadow. Each day, he woke up facing difficult decisions. The feeling that he hadn't done enough, that he wasn't yet deserving of forgiveness, kept him restless at night. He had thought that actions and apologies might suffice. But deep down, John knew that his remorse had to be accompanied by true transformation, an awakening from within. David, the man he had once mistreated, remained a constant presence in his thoughts, even though they had crossed paths at workshops and during chance encounters. John still felt he hadn't earned the right to stand on equal footing with David. He saw himself as a sinner, living under the burden of redemption, while David, with his unwavering calm and respect, represented the ultimate challenge he had to overcome. Every time he saw David, John asked himself, "Have I done enough? Are my efforts enough for David and society to recognize that I've changed?" He understood that this journey had no endpoint. To truly better himself, John needed to confront the darker parts of his soul that he had long tried to hide. The inner struggle between his past and present became increasingly intense. The public discussions about racial discrimination, the charity work he took part in, every activity forced him to reassess his words and actions. He felt the silent scrutiny of those around him, and at times, even he couldn't forgive himself for what he had done. One evening, while participating in a conversation at an anti-racism organization, John overheard a discussion between two women in the group. They were talking about a white man who had recently joined, someone trying to rebuild himself. "He's made mistakes, but I think he's doing well," one said. "The question is, can he maintain this change?" The other replied. The words echoed in John's mind, and in that moment, he realized that he was in the exact same position. Change was not easy. He couldn't expect immediate forgiveness from those around him. Similarly, the people he had hurt couldn't be expected to forget his actions so easily. Most importantly, he couldn't measure his transformation by external deeds alone. True change had to come from within, a profound shift in his mindset and the way he viewed the world. The mixed feelings of regret and belief in his ability to change were what John felt most acutely at this moment. Though he had begun engaging in community activities, advocating for racial equality and tolerance, his career and personal life remained entangled in the lingering shadows of old prejudices. He was beginning to understand that making amends wasn't a simple task. It was a long, arduous battle fraught with challenges. John still hadn't earned recognition from the community he lived in. The people around him, whether friends or colleagues, seemed to keep their distance. Their gazes no longer reflected admiration or respect as they once had. Instead, they carried an air of doubt and ambiguity. In their eyes, John's past still surrounded him like a shell that couldn't be shed. One morning, as John walked into the office, he noticed an unusual atmosphere. His colleagues no longer spoke openly with him, and group conversations had become sparse. During a meeting, a major client of the company, someone John had worked with for years, didn't shy away from referencing the incident on the street. Though they didn't name him directly, "We need to ensure that everyone on our team upholds the company's values," the client said. The statement left John feeling exposed. He didn't know how to respond and could only sit silently, the oppressive weight of the moment bearing down on him. When the meeting ended, John returned to his desk. Inside, waves of emotion began to surge. He had been trying to change. But was that change enough for others to see him differently? The guilt, the regret, and the self-doubt came flooding back. He realized that while he was striving to transform himself, society wasn't ready to fully accept that transformation. John had never felt loneliness like this before. Even though he participated in anti-racism organizations, he couldn't escape the feeling of being an outsider. He couldn't erase the wounds he had inflicted, nor could he simply forget everything and move on as if nothing had happened. But in this moment, John came to an important realization. Change wasn't just about pleasing others. It was a long journey toward making peace with himself. He couldn't expect society to forgive him instantly. All he could do was give his best effort to prove that his transformation was genuine. that he wasn't just someone shaped by outdated prejudices but someone now standing for justice, fairness, and equality for all. The weight of exhaustion and unease had burdened John's mind for a long time, but finally, he realized he couldn't continue living in fear and guilt. He had made too many mistakes in the past. But if he didn't act now, he would never have the chance to make things right. One day, John decided to do something he had never thought he would do before. He sought out David, not to beg for forgiveness, but to face the man he had wronged and to express all that he had been feeling during this time. Their meeting took place on a late afternoon. As the golden hues of sunset blanketed the city, David, as always, appeared calm and composed. He showed no signs of anger or resentment, but his gaze carried a profound sense of understanding. "David," John began, his voice trembling but resolute, "I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I regret it. I want you to understand that I'm trying to change. I'm not the person I used to be." David looked at him for a long moment, saying nothing. After a brief silence, he replied in a calm but deeply empathetic tone, "Change isn't easy, John, but I believe you can do it. What's important is that you stay committed, not for me or anyone else to see the change, but for you to see it in yourself." The next day, John embarked on a new chapter in his life. He wasn't changing just for himself, but for the society around him. He decided he wouldn't allow racism and outdated prejudices to persist in his community any longer. John began working more closely with anti-racism organizations, not just attending workshops but also organizing meetings to advocate for fairness and equality. John's life began to see significant changes. He felt a sense of pride in what he was doing and realized that living authentically, without hiding or avoiding his past, was the path to finding true peace within himself. Those around him started to notice the genuine transformation in him. While not everyone was quick to forgive, John demonstrated that he had truly changed. Finally, standing before an audience during a public discussion and sharing his story, John understood that true change wasn't just about confronting his mistakes but about continuing the journey and never reverting to those old errors. In this journey, he realized he had found a deeper sense of freedom than ever before. David continued to observe John's transformation with patience and careful attention. While John wrestled with his own conflicting emotions and faced the challenges of reintegrating into the community, David was fighting his own internal struggle. He understood that it wasn't just John being tested. He, too, was facing a difficult dilemma. David had witnessed the changes in John since their first encounter. However, he was cautious not to offer forgiveness or acceptance too easily. He knew that true change had to be proven through consistent actions, not just words or surface-level gestures. Though he was willing to forgive, he wanted to ensure that John understood the profound difficulty and perseverance required for genuine transformation. One day, when John approached David to ask about the next steps in his journey, David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he invited John to a special gathering. This wasn't an ordinary discussion but an opportunity to confront the pain inflicted by society on those who had suffered from racism. David invited John to a sharing session with individuals who had been victims of racial discrimination. The gathering took place in a modest setting, yet it carried immense power. Each participant shared their stories of pain and the challenges they had endured because of their race. John sat in silence, listening intently and feeling the weight of the suffering these people had faced simply because they were different. He couldn't believe that the prejudices he had once embraced could cause such profound harm. Confronted with this reality, John couldn't hold back his tears. David sat beside him, saying nothing, letting John absorb it all. It was a lesson that couldn't be easily taught. But John realized that this was a pivotal moment in his journey of change. To truly transform, he couldn't remain in the insulated world of those like him. He needed to expand his perspective and genuinely listen to the stories of those whom society had overlooked or hurt. After the deeply emotional gathering, John couldn't stop reflecting on everything he had been through. He realized that change wasn't just an outward act in society but an intensely difficult internal process. What he had done in the past weren't merely mistakes. They were wounds within himself, dark parts of his soul that he had been too afraid to confront. One afternoon, while walking in the park, John stopped in front of a large tree, a place he often visited to reflect. He sat down and allowed his thoughts to flow freely. He had once lived in the safe confines of prejudices and divisions, but now he felt lost in the very society he thought he had understood. David had taught him that true change couldn't come solely from outward actions. To truly transform, John had to face himself. He couldn't hide from the mistakes of his past, nor could he blame circumstances or others. He had to take responsibility for his actions and understand that tolerance and equality had to begin within each individual. John began to educate himself about the history of marginalized communities, learning about the pain they had endured and the unrelenting struggles they had faced to reclaim justice. He read books, watched documentaries, and participated in dialogues. Each time, he felt the weight of their suffering, the sacrifices they had made to fight against discrimination. This not only deepened his awareness of his own failures, but also gave him a newfound strength to continue his journey. Eventually, John realized that no path is easy, but change is an unending journey. He couldn't undo the past, but he could start anew today and work toward a future where there was no place for racism or prejudice. With his shift in mindset and actions, John decided to take part in a significant project aimed at supporting those who faced racial discrimination and creating equitable opportunities for everyone. His project wasn't just about breaking down racial barriers, but also about building a platform where marginalized individuals could grow and assert themselves. He began organizing training sessions, hosting discussions on equality, and creating job opportunities for people from disadvantaged communities. His colleagues at the company, who had once doubted his transformation, started to recognize John's genuine efforts. These actions not only helped the community but also reshaped society's perception of individuals who had made mistakes in the past. David remained a companion and a quiet observer of John's journey but refrained from direct involvement. He understood that John needed to prove to himself and to others that he could sustain this change, not just for his own sake but for the benefit of those around him. Every step John took, no matter how small, was part of his greater mission to seek justice and equality for all. One day, during a community celebration marking progress and change, John stood on stage, looking out at the audience. It was a deeply emotional moment. He saw faces he had once overlooked, people he had once dismissed, but now, they stood there, looking back at him with respect and understanding. It was the kind of change John had worked so hard to achieve. At the end of the story, John realized that his journey wasn't just about personal redemption, but about rebuilding the values he had once lost. He had confronted the mistakes of his past and found a way to start over. Though the path was far from easy, each step brought him closer to a sense of personal growth and fulfillment. Finally, David came to see John again, not to evaluate him, but to tell him that he had truly proven what David had long believed. You don't need to be perfect, John. You just need to be someone who can acknowledge your mistakes and do the right thing moving forward. John smiled. He had learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the past but about living with it, accepting it, and using it as a tool to build a better future. Everything he had gone through, the mistakes, the struggles, was part of his journey toward justice and reconciliation. In the end, John understood that justice wasn't merely about judgment. It was about understanding and action. And from that moment on, he committed to being part of that journey, not just for himself but for everyone still facing the injustices of society.